Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Ari, and today we're going to have some more stories about our toxic life. But before we start, it would be so much appreciated if you would subscribe to my channel, like the video, if you enjoy it, and maybe leave a comment down below. These simple clicks would mean a lot to the future of this channel and really reward the effort that I put in every day. And now without further ado, let's go. Today's first story. In this story, a couple eagerly sent their kids to summer camp for alone time. They disagreed on vacation plans, leading to a rift. They took separate trips. The husband discovered his wife's affair in Georgia and confronted her, leading to separation. The wife's relationship with her children suffered. Despite her own relationship issues, she stayed with her cheating partner until his death, now likely living in poverty away from her children. Now let's get into the story. My wife, 40 female, and I, 45 male, were extremely excited to send the kids to summer camp for a month. We hadn't had alone time in over a year, and she was always a little worried about having sex at night because she didn't want them to hear anything. Once they were gone, we had one extremely romantic night where we had loud sex in random places. It was wonderful, but the next day we were content. Having any more loud, randomly placed sex seemed unnecessary, and my wife started to get depressed and talk about the kids coming home. I asked her where she wanted to go if she could go anywhere, and she said Georgia. It was where she grew up and where her parents lived in a nursing home. I absolutely hated Georgia. I only lived there for a few years, but it was a terrible town where I feared getting caught in the crossfire of a drug deal that went south. I never got shot, but I was dragged into neighborhood drama and victim to several robberies. If I was to go anywhere, I'd want to go to Kentucky to stay at my uncle's. He was like a father figure to me, and for much of my adult life, our relationship was long distance. He was getting older, and I wanted one more visit where I got to help him work on his old cars. Our vacation discussion only made the atmosphere in the house worse. It felt like we were growing apart, but I didn't want to see it that way. I knew something had to be done, so I called my wife's closest friend, Penny, to ask what she thought we should do. She recommended we take a trip separately and volunteered to go with my wife to Georgia. I loved this idea, even though I was nervous to split from my wife. I'd slept next to her every night for more than 13 years, but I thought maybe that was why it was time for us to have our own adventure and miss each other a little. I proposed this idea to my wife, and she was all for it since we'd be back before summer camp was over. She started planning, packing, and texting on her phone. I was actually a little bummed that she didn't show any hesitation apart from me, but I knew she was a strong woman, so I didn't let it get to me. However, a week into her separate vacations, she started replying less to my texts, and whenever she did reply, it was short. I was having a great time with my uncle, and I did manage to forget about my wife and phone for a while. But I eventually felt like I had to message Penny to ask if my wife was behaving strangely. She was hesitant to tell me that my wife went out without her a few nights, and most recently she hadn't slept at the hotel. I freaked out. My heart had been telling me something was up, but I didn't listen. I asked if she had any idea where she'd be, and she didn't know. I remember that my wife signed into her Facebook Messenger on my phone once when her phone was broken. I was able to sign back in and look through her messages. I found one string with an old flame of hers who lived in Georgia and talked about how nice it would be if she ever came back to Georgia for a visit. They exchanged Snapchat IDs, and that was the end of the messages there. I looked up AP's name online and paid $2 to see a list of his most recent addresses. According to this, he lived 45 minutes away from my in-laws' nursing home. I drove 6 hours to the address and arrived at 1 a.m., finding my wife's car in the driveway. I couldn't believe I actually found her. I banged on the door until AP answered it, with a gun in my face. I demanded my wife back. His look went from angry to surprised. She came out in a robe, full of disbelief. She asked how I found her and started shaking and crying. Before I answered her, she pleaded with AP to lower the gun and told me we should just go home because this was a huge mistake. I looked at AP and asked him if he had sex with my wife. He said, yeah, called me a name, and asked what I was going to do about it. I told him he spoke like a coward behind a gun. In his anger, he raised it again, which made my wife start screaming and pleading. I backed up towards my car with my hands up, telling my wife she's not coming with me. She expressed her disbelief as I said she could stay with this jerk for all I cared. She wailed and asked me about the kids as I shut my door, and yelled out the window that she should have thought about them before she'd been here on me. I drove all the way home in silence. I broke the news to the kids that Mommy wouldn't be living with us anymore because she married another man. They were confused and heartbroken, and whenever she video called them, it was extremely awkward and nothing like being there in person. She didn't try to visit for a year, and whenever she did, the damage to her relationship with the kids was painfully obvious. They didn't want to listen to her, they didn't want to hug her, and they argued about everything she told them. She went back to AP and continued living with him even after she found him cheating on her. She just started ranting about it on Facebook, talking about how it was the last time and she was going to leave and never look back. That kept happening for 5 years until AP died unexpectedly. Now I don't know where she's living, but I assume she's somewhere in Georgia, surviving in poverty without knowing her teenage children. Today's second story. In this story, OP discovers his wife's cheating with his best friend. Wife's behavior becomes suspect after Wayne confesses to seeing her changing at the beach and then later catches her in an intimate act at home. The husband confronts them both, feeling deeply betrayed and ending his marriage and friendship. Now let's get into the story. My wife, 25 female, didn't have a job, but she was really into gardening. She found opportunities whenever she could to sell potted plants as a vendor at local events. I, 30 male, was working full-time as a director of operations for a shipping company. We were married for 4 years and managed to keep a good balance of work and play. Our friends would come over about 3 times a month. We each only had one close friend that we felt comfortable enough to invite over. My best friend was Wayne, and her best friend was Camila. They were friends with us since middle school, so they were people we trusted enough to have in our home. I was thankful I managed to keep in contact with Wayne over the years despite my hectic schedule. While we had our friends over, I started noticing that my wife would sometimes talk to Wayne more than Camila. I wasn't too worried because my wife and Wayne were naturally very talkative, while Camila and I would often quiet down and listen. I was nothing but thankful on these nights because I felt like life was good. I had a job I loved, a wife I loved, and friends to celebrate with. I heard enough stories to know I was the lucky one. On Monday, I was at work after spending the day before at the beach with our friends. Wayne texted me that he had something to admit. He said yesterday at the beach, he accidentally saw my wife changing in one of the flimsy tents. They made eye contact, but she still didn't stop on the dressing. Instead, she smiled mischievously and continued showing him things until there wasn't anything more to show. He finally left when he was overcome with guilt. He was telling me the truth because he wanted to be honest and maintain our friendship. I thanked him, but I did have to ask him a favor. I needed him to step out of our lives for a while to discourage any wild emotions from rising in my wife. She needed to forget about this naughty behavior. Wayne agreed, but I could tell it was with reluctance. When I got home, I asked my wife how she felt about him. She was caught off guard and got a little defensive, asking me what I meant and why I was asking. I convinced her I wasn't trying to start a fight. I just wanted to know how she felt about him. She cautiously admitted that she had grown to care about him very much as Camila, and she couldn't imagine our lives without him. Needless to say, she sounded a little too attached to my good friend. I think her head was swimming with feelings that stemmed from secretly stripping for him. My wife noticed almost immediately that Wayne was no longer present in our life. Camila would come over for dinner and a game, but Wayne wasn't responding. Usually, it was my task to invite my friend over, so she asked me where he was. I said he wouldn't be seeing us for a while because he had some personal things he needed to sort through. My wife immediately felt like this had something to do with what happened on the beach. I could tell because she seemed ashamed and worried that I knew something. She didn't know how to ask me, so a few awkward weeks passed. After letting some peaceful time pass between us, she finally asked me if I heard anything from him. I just told her he was fine and asked her if there was anything she should tell me. She said no, so I went to work. I was growing impatient and wanted her to tell me the truth. While I was at work, our neighbor called me. There was a man who was visiting my wife while I was out. I raced home without telling my boss, busted down my own door, and found my wife having intimate with Wayne. I grabbed him and yanked him away before hitting him and knocking him to the floor. He jumped to his feet, put him on his pants in a hurry, and ran out of our house. I couldn't believe the man I just caught with my wife was my best friend. That wasn't the man I knew and trusted. All those personal conversations we had, where we helped each other through like curveballs, felt like a lie. Then I looked at my wife. She looked devastated, like I cheated on her. She started telling me she was sorry and that she couldn't help how she felt about AP. Knowing him all these years as a single man who longed for love made her care deeply until she couldn't resist giving herself to him. I told her she was nothing but a weak-willed, meaningless liar. I was the one that married her. I was the one that provided for her for years and trusted her with my life and love. I trusted her and my best friend to respect and honor me as much as I did them. I told her neither of them had to have intimate with the other. It was just a spontaneous thing that turned them on, and they were so careless that they gave into it. I was now embarrassed to have her as my wife and him as my friend, so I refused to continue these relationships any longer. My speech got to her. She was shocked at the truth of what I said and admitted I was right. She proved herself to be untrustworthy and undeserving. She moved out completely ashamed and remorseful. I knew she wouldn't have cheated on me again, but no one can really know that for sure. I knew that I'd always remember that she cheated on me. That would make it extremely hard, if not impossible, to ever forgive her or stop doubting the legitimacy of our bond. My best friend never spoke to me or my wife again, not even after our divorce. My ex lived with one of her coworkers and carpooled to work for a while. I don't know what happened after that because we stopped all communication. Today's third story. In this story, a couple with a seemingly perfect life hits a rough patch when the husband discovers his wife's affair with their daughter's piano instructor. He gathers evidence, confronts her publicly during a dinner party, and plans for divorce. The neighbor who recommended the instructor apologizes and fires him. They agree on custody, but divorce looms, leaving the wife financially independent with the house. Now let's get into the story. My wife and I met back in college, and we hit it off right away. We were like two peas in a pod, always up for an adventure. After graduation, we tied the knot and started building our dream life together. We even had a little bundle of joy and worked hard to be able to give her the best things in life. Fast forward a few years and things are going well for us. We have a beautiful home, great friends, and we both have amazing jobs. It's a picture-perfect life. On top of that, according to our daughter's teacher, she has a natural talent for the piano. The decision to foster her love of music was easy, so we looked into hiring an after-school piano instructor for her. One of my neighbors recommended a guy that he used to teach his son how to play the guitar, so we hired him. He's a young man, a recent graduate from music school, just looking for a way to pay his bills. I actually kind of liked him. He seemed like a nice guy. My wife only worked part-time, so she was home during the lessons a lot of the time. He came by every Monday and Wednesday to teach her. By the time I got in, he was usually wrapping things up and getting ready to leave. After a few weeks of him working for us, I started noticing some changes in my wife. She became distant, her smile seemed forced, and something just felt off. At first, I figured it was work stress messing with my head, but when it continued, I started to worry. The first real clue about something going on came when I saw her get a text message from the piano instructor. She quickly picked her phone up, tilted it away from me while she read it, and walked out of the room. That didn't seem like a good sign at all. Instead of jumping to conclusions and accusing her of something, I turned into a bit of a detective. I needed to see how she interacted with him, so I started coming home earlier in the day. I started picking up on some shady vibes, long conversations that seemed a little too cozy, and a lot of glances at each other. Their body language was more intimate than it should have been. My gut told me that there was something more going on. I needed to gather the evidence to prove it. I bought some tiny security cameras, and when my wife was out grocery shopping, I installed them in some prime places. One in the living room overlooking the piano, one in the kitchen, and one in our bedroom. It didn't take long for them to have been put to good use. At the end of the first week they were installed, I checked the footage. As clear as day, my wife watched the instructor come in and start teaching my daughter for an hour. She then sent her to her room to play, telling her the lesson was over before she led the instructor into the kitchen. They kissed and embraced and did many other things while they thought they were completely alone. That was all I needed to see. Divorce was imminent for us. It was the last thing I wanted, but I couldn't accept that behavior and pretend like nothing happened. I was hurt, angry, and confused by her actions. Maybe I shouldn't have done the next part, but I needed to get some kind of revenge on her. We had a dinner planned with some of our friends and neighbors. It was going to be a big thing. All of the kids would be next door with a sitter, and we adults were going to have a few drinks and unwind. I thought it was the perfect time to share what I'd found out about my wife. Before the night of the dinner, I made sure to invite our piano instructor. He tried to decline, but I insisted he come. He eventually accepted the invite when he thought he might get a few new clients. During the dinner, while the spirits were high, I stood up and made a toast. I turned to my wife and told her how glad I was to have found out who she really was. I said that being married to her for 20-something more years would have been torture. She looked hurt and confused. Then I explained that I didn't want to be married to a cheater. The room was silent, and she looked at me as if she had no idea what I was talking about. So I elaborated and told everyone about the affair she had with the piano instructor. I pulled the video up on my phone and held it out for everyone to see. Everyone in the room was shocked and stared at me as if I had two heads. It didn't take long for people to take their leave, and my wife and I were left alone in her house. She asked me how I knew, and I explained it all. She told me that it had just happened, and she never meant for it to go as far as it did, then begged me for a second chance. I just told her that I meant what I said and informed her to keep an eye out for divorce papers. The neighbor that recommended the instructor to me called me a few days later and apologized. He'd apparently felt partially responsible for what happened. He told me that he fired him and called a few other people he referred to him and explained the story. He expected that he would lose those jobs too. In an effort to keep things calm and normal for our kid, I'm letting my wife keep the house, though she still has hundreds of thousands of dollars in payment. Friends left to make on her own without any spousal support. We have come to an agreement for custody, and we're going to try to be as cordial as possible for our daughter's sake.